Welcome, everybody. My name is Amy Schmidt. I'm a professor at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and I have research and extension appointments focused on livestock manure management and mortality management, and just addressing environmental concerns kind of at the nexus of livestock production, crop production, and communities. So I get the pleasure of starting us off today. I'm going to talk about safeguarding herd health and water quality during on-farm swine carcass disposal. Just to give you kind of an overview of what you'll hear from the three of us today, we're all covering research describing studies on methods for staging and disposing of swine carcasses resulting from a foreign animal disease outbreak. Of course, all farms have routine mortality losses, but there's an urgent need to understand how to handle a larger scale mortality loss that's caused by a foreign animal disease. Because one important aspect of that is that if there's a foreign animal disease, pig movement will be shut down, at least within the vicinity of the farm where that disease is confirmed. And so disposal of those carcasses will have to occur on farm. They won't be able to be moved to a second location. So for my presentation, I'm going to talk about a field scale carcass disposal study that we ran here in Nebraska. It started in the fall of 2022. And it was sort of the endpoint of a week-long foreign animal disease response exercise that was done here in the state. So that involved Department of Ag, Emergency Management, personnel, National Pork Board, Nebraska Pork Producers. So it was a large event where they went through the process of identifying or suspecting, confirming, reporting a foreign animal disease. And at the end of the week, we did a demonstration of depopulation and disposal of swine carcasses. We also did, after the field study, went on to do a leachate transport study and then a modeling study to look at suitability of different land areas in the state for disposal of carcasses via composting or shallow burial with carbon. But for today's presentation, I'm just going to focus on that field study. So we were looking at evaluating metrics related to groundwater quality risks and biosecurity. And so for groundwater quality risks, we evaluated the volume and characteristics of leachate produced in each disposal unit over the year-long study. For the biosecurity risk, we were focused on monitoring temperatures inside the disposal units. Our goal, two time temperature goals, were reaching 104 degrees for at least 5 days Fahrenheit and 131 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 4 hours. So if you're familiar with the EPA regulations for composting of sewage sludge to achieve Class A biosolids for land application, those are the time temperature goals outlined in that regulation. And, there's different time temperature combinations that can effectively reduce pathogens. So this isn't to say that these are the only temperatures over these amount of times that are needed, but it at least gives us a standard by which to measure the success of our different treatments. And then in addition to that, we also recognize that scavenging animals can be a transmission vector for disease if they disrupt carcass disposal systems. And so we monitored animal activity at our site as well. So we compared 3 different disposal methods. We wanted to do side-by-side comparisons of these. So there were a total of 6 units, 2 each that were whole carcass composting, which is, most of you are probably familiar with. There's a base layer of carbon material. Carcasses are placed on top of that, and then they're covered with more carbon material and in a windrow compost. We also looked at ground carcass composting. So that relies on grinding the carcasses and carbon material together and then placing that mixture on a layer of carbon material, just like we do with the whole carcass composting. And then again, covering that with organic matter. And then the third method was shallow burial with carbon, which is sometimes called above ground burial. And this method, there's been a fair bit of research that's been done on this, and I feel like it is a method that probably deserves some attention, especially in Nebraska. Deserves to be considered as an allowable disposal method. It's not right now. But the above ground burial is, I consider it kind of a cross between composting and traditional land burial. So rather than just digging a hole, putting the carcasses in and covering it up with soil, this involves digging a kind of shallow hole, 18 to 24 inches deep, adding bedding material or carbon material to the bottom of that, placing the carcasses in it. And then rather than covering carcasses with more carbon material, they're covered with that excavated soil. So let's take a look then at the construction of those disposal units. So on the left, you can see up close one of the units. And so these were excavated out at our research farm by very skilled operators of excavation equipment, and they did a great job. So they're sloped from the top end down to the bottom, sloped from the outside towards the center. We had a leachate collection pipe that we were able to access the leachate from a standpipe on each unit, and we lined those with an impermeable liner. So, of course, in a real carcass disposal situation, we wouldn't use a liner, at least not here in the state of Nebraska. We typically, whether it's land burial or composting, we don't typically require a liner or a impermeable foundation. So that could have affected some of our heating and the performance of these units, but it did allow us to collect leachate and really understand the difference in volume and characteristics of leachate produced over time from these units. So once the units were established, we put our carbon material in the base. We used wood chips, kind of a hardwood mulch, which if you are familiar with composting, you probably wonder why in the world we would choose something like mulch or wood chips that is not super absorbent, doesn't degrade easily, doesn't break down easily. Our theory on that was in an emergency situation with carcass, a large volume of carcasses that need to be handled, we're going to be lucky to get the amount of carbon material that we want to get, let alone getting the best quality of carbon material. And there's been a lot of tree clearing activities in Nebraska and chipping of cedar trees as part of that management practice. And so our thought was that if in the worst case scenario, a farmer could not access carbon material of a different nature, they could have trees ground on their own property to use as their carbon material in a large scale disposal practice. So keep that in mind. We definitely did not design it with the ideal carbon material in it. So this is what our disposal units looked like. They were all 15 feet wide, 22 feet long. Like I said, the bottom was sloped to a permeated pipe, and we were able to collect leachate from that. So as far as placing pigs in there, we received 150 culled pigs for this project, and they were pretty high, pretty decent range in weights. So in order to ensure that we had as similar of a mass of carcasses in all of the basins as possible, we randomly sorted animals by weight and assigned them in a spreadsheet to each disposal unit, so that by the end, we came out with a pretty uniform mass of animals in each one. And it worked out well. Each of the units received a little over 5,800 pounds of carcasses, and our standard deviation was around 91 pounds plus or minus. So I felt like we managed to get those 150 pigs distributed between the 6 disposal units pretty well. So this on the left shows our compost unit, pigs laid on top of the base material, and then they'll be covered with additional carbon. On the right is the grinder that was used to produce the materials for the ground carcass composting. And so basically a bucket load of wood chips and a bucket load of carcasses were placed in the grinder together so that the material that came out was reduced in size quite a bit and already well mixed. And then it was placed on the disposal unit, similar to how you see the pigs here. So if I were to do the study over, I would skip this part, but hindsight's 2020, of course. We have a local initiative in the city of Lincoln, Nebraska, and in the county in which we're located to produce biochar from yard waste, essentially trees and limbs. And they had a whole lot of biochar, and they wanted to give us some to use in this study to see if it had an impact on heating and moisture retention in those piles. And so we ended up putting biochar in one replication of each of those 3 treatments. And we put it in at 5% of carcass mass. And it was based on some similar studies, mainly looking at poultry carcass composting with biochar added to improve performance of that system. We'd log temperatures every 3 minutes throughout the year-long study, and those were temperature sensors placed down the center line of the disposal basins, one set of sensors below the carcasses and another set above the carcasses. And so this, you kind of get an overhead view here and then a side view here on the left. So you're seeing the elevation from 0 up to 4 feet, and from 0 to 22 feet, the length of those units. These are your carcasses in the middle. These are your sensors below carcasses and your sensors above the carcasses. And just to kind of give another view of the construction of those compost units, wood chips, carcasses, a thin layer of biochar in one of each of those. Wood chips that were wetted, we achieved 40% moisture content on those. We would have liked to have been a little higher, but that's what it came out as. And then covered with the dry wood chips. So here's a shot of one of each of those treatments once they were completed. So the top 2 are your carcass or compost units, and the bottom is a shallow barrel with carbon. Again, covered with carbon wood chips up here. This one covered with the soil that we excavated to create the disposal basin. We collected leachate every 2 weeks from each of those 6 units. The total volume was recorded, and then we kept 2 liters of leachate from each sample period, each unit, for analysis and for later use in those column studies that I talked about earlier. We also enumerated samples for E. coli, using E. coli as an indicator organism to assess pathogen risk associated with the leachate that was produced from each treatment. So every 2 weeks, again, these samples were taken back to the lab, serially diluted, and incubated on selective agar. We also had our trail cameras out there, mounted back here on trees so that we had a view of the entire study area, so we could keep an eye on scavenging animals. And these were motion activated cameras. So anytime there was movement, they took images of the site. So let's look at some results here. And I'm 14 minutes in. I wanted to try to keep to 15 or 16. So it's hard to go through all of this data and just to share everything I want without skipping anything, but I'm going to move along here. One thing I wanted to point out is that not all of our sensors operated correctly to take temperatures in those piles throughout the study. I think this was a human error, And it wasn't something I knew about until the study was over. So we didn't get a chance to correct that issue. So basically, there were 3 sensors in each of our 6 disposal units that worked. At least one was below carcasses in all of those, and at least one working sensor was above carcasses. So we still got decent data that we could work with, but not ideal. Ideally, I was shooting for being able to do a kriging analysis and look at cross-sectional heating profile in those units at each distance down the length of the pile where we had sensors. So we didn't get to do that, but we were able to analyze data in another way. So the 3 graphs here represent mean temperature throughout the year-long study among the sensors in each disposal unit that were working. So 3 sensors in each unit recorded. Those are averaged over the full year. So in the upper left corner, the dark line represents the mean temperature throughout the year in the shallow burial with carbon disposal unit. The lighter colored one is the shallow burial carbon unit that had biochar added. Up in the right corner, the darker line is the whole carcass compost unit temperatures. The lighter yellow is the whole carcass compost unit with biochar added. And then down here, darker green is the ground carcass composting, and a little bit lighter. It's not probably shown up great on the screen, but the triangle shape, that is the ground carcass composting unit with biochar added. So we see, I've identified on here that 131 degrees Fahrenheit that we were targeting. We did hit that in all of the disposal units. So that was a positive. One of the things that we wanted to understand, even though we couldn't do that kriging analysis, was did we hit those, how long did we maintain that temperature of 131 degrees Fahrenheit or greater? So in this slide, I'm showing for each type of disposal unit, ignoring the biochar that was added. So this is both shallow burial with carbon units, both whole carcass composting, and both ground carcass composting averaged together. This shows the temperature sensor that we had data from. So in the shallow burial with carbon, we had 2 sensors below the animals that we got data from and 1 above the animals. Same with whole carcass below and above, and then 1 below and 2 above for the ground carcass. But what I want to point out is this is the number of days in the first 30 days of the study that the temperature among those or at those points was at least 131 degrees Fahrenheit. So remember, our target was we want to hit 131 for at least 4 hours. And in all of these, we hit that for several days. So even though there was a variability in temperature among them, overall, they all performed very well temperature-wise. As far as leachate production, shallow burial with carbon, and again, ignoring the biochar addition, shallow burial with carbon, there was significantly less leachate per mass of carcasses. And these are standardized based on the total volume that was collected and the total mass of animals in that particular disposal unit. So quite a bit higher production of leachate from the composting units. I'm going to skip past these for the sake of time, but these are the nutrient loads by treatment. And overall, we saw lower nutrient loads coming from the shallow burial with carbon. And if there's questions about that, we can talk a bit more after the other presentations. But for E. coli treatment or E. coli enumeration, again, these are E. coli concentrations summed over the whole year-long study, and they account for concentration and volume of leachate produced. So what we're getting is a total colony-forming units of E. coli per pound of carcass, the mean for the shallow burial with carbon, the mean for the whole carcass composting, and the mean for the ground carcass composting. So these makes them more comparable when we standardize them across all those measurements. And we had, around two log higher counts of colony forming units of E. coli in the composting bin in the shallow barrel with carbon. Animal activity, lots of animals. They're very interested in the units out there. They did dig in the compost piles a fair bit. They didn't seem to even notice that the shallow barrel of carbon units were there. So just to summarize the data, all of the units, we achieved that temperature above 131 degrees Fahrenheit, well beyond the 4 hours that we were shooting for. Mean E. coli loads, when we compare those, couple log reductions in the shallow barrel with carbon units. Leachate production was far lower from the shallow barrel with carbon units than the composting ones. And as far as animal activity, I gave the thumbs up for the shallow barrel with carbon because we didn't have scavenging animals there. Thumbs down for the other two because we had quite a bit of activity. Overall, I think shallow barrel with carbon seems like a very reasonable and a good option for disposal for a number of reasons. So I'm going to wrap it up with that. Again, biochar didn't seem to significantly impact any of our performance metrics. So that's why I didn't talk about it much. But I'm going